Good evening, everybody. It's 6 o'clock, so we're going to make a start. Can I start with item 1, which is the notice filming at meetings? I don't intend to read it out, but I would draw it to everyone's attention. Item 2, apologies for absence.
Chair, we have apologies for absence from Councillor Weston.
Thanks, Aisha. We move then to item 3, declarations of interest. Anyone need to make a declaration? No. Okay. Item 4, matters referred to Cabinet by the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. As everyone knows, this is a special meeting of the Cabinet held to reconsider the decision of the preferred bidder for the Haringey development vehicle. If I invite Councillor Wright, please, to give us an outline of the special Overview and Scrutiny meeting. And what we'll do is Councillor Wright will speak. I will then ask Councillor Strickland to respond to the recommendations put forward by the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. And then, as people will be aware, there is actually exempt information, so we'll have any discussion that relates to any of the information that isn't exempt at that point in time, but then we will move into private session after. Is that all agreed? That through? Okay, Councillor Wright.
Thank you. Just briefly then. As you know, the Overview and Scrutiny Committee considered the Cabinet's decision of the 14th of February to appoint a preferred bidder and proceed to the preferred bidder stage of the process at a special meeting on the 2nd of March. We heard from 2 deputations, including Northumberland Park residents and, excuse me, and the Unite and GMB trade unions, as well as from the signatories of the 2 call-in requests. And it was, as people know, a long meeting. I'm grateful to all participants, including officers. But it is an important matter, and it's a matter of significant public interest, and it was right, I think, that the Scrutiny Committee ensured that all the issues being raised in respect of the Cabinet decision had a full airing. The committee took the view it would be most appropriate, for the purposes of allowing detailed further consideration of the matters raised in the call-ins, for the decision to be referred here back to the Cabinet as the executive decision maker in this case, for you to look again and ensure that the points made to us and in our discussions are taken into account. I will just say I think you and we, and most importantly the people of the borough, need to be reasonably assured that if this development vehicle goes ahead, it is established in a way which affords safeguards for public assets and public investment, but also makes the most of them to contribute to genuine solutions for people in housing need in the borough. So to assist your reconsideration, we made a number of specific recommendations, which I'll just highlight briefly, if I may. Firstly, the Cabinet makes a firm commitment that there be no allocation of any sites to an to a development vehicle without a full equalities impact assessment being undertaken for each site. Secondly, the Cabinet agree that any allocation of Category 1 sites does include specific policies, including around eviction, to guarantee a right of return for residents and leaseholders on the same terms and conditions, to be agreed with the tenants and leaseholders affected, taking into account their housing conditions and requirements. Should the Cabinet agree to proceed tonight, we will have a period of discussion with the successful bidder. But it was the view of the Scrutiny Committee that the way should be found during these discussions to express in policy the commitments that have been made publicly to date. Recommendation 3 relates to the suggestion of a construction exclusivity agreement and the concerns that have been expressed in both call-ins around value for money. So we recommend the Cabinet ensure there is no agreement with for any development vehicle partner without effective arrangements to ensure value for money in respect of any construction exclusivity arrangements on a site-by-site basis, including undertaking independent assessment to demonstrate value for money for the Council. Fourthly, and mindful of the continuing crisis of affordability of housing in London, most recently highlighted in today's report from the Centre of London and the public requests which came from various local authorities, including Haringey. I note for government action on that front, specifically around right to buy and borrowing limits. We ask Cabinet ensure no loss of target rent properties on Category 1 sites, and also seek to ensure the provision of 50% genuinely affordable housing on those sites. Fifthly, a number of points were made to us around historic allegations and indeed findings of blacklisting. Practice of blacklisting should have no place in the employment practices of businesses. We recommend the Cabinet enter into discussions with appropriate trade unions regarding historical allegations of blacklisting involving the preferred bidder, and to ensure that relevant mitigations around the collective and individual rights of trade unions and trade union members are put in place, so that the organisation partnering with the Council also fully embraces partnership with the unions representing workers in their business. And final recommendation, Cabinet ensure that any agreement with any HDV partner include arrangements with the construction subsidiary of the HDV partner and other subsidiaries as appropriate to provide local employment and training opportunities, particularly in respect of equalities groups, including job support and training for disabled people. So that's that's highlights of the recommendations we made. So I'll finish there. Take any questions if. All right.
Thank you very much, Councillor Wright. Does anyone have a question for Councillor Wright, Cabinet members? I thought that was fairly clear and went through the recommendations at paragraph 3, which are on page 2 of the papers that we have in front of us. No, in which case, Councillor Strickland, can I ask you to respond?
Thank you, Leader, and thank you to Councillor Wright and the committee for their work last week. So if I just quickly run through the recommendations and explain what the Cabinet response is. So the first recommendation was around equalities impact assessments. So obviously, as discussed previously, any site that the Council wants to give to the HGV has to come to Cabinet as a specific report, and of course all of those reports have to have an equalities impact assessment attached, so that's absolutely fine. The second recommendation was on right of return for residents and leaseholders on the same terms and conditions. So I think we've been over this ground repeatedly, Leader, and made a very clear commitment on that. Also important to say, though, that the offer to leaseholders will be different. There's different statutory provision for leaseholders, but as has been made clear before, we absolutely will be working with tenants and with leaseholders. There's ongoing consultation in the key Category 1 regeneration areas, and just like we did in the Love Lane estate, we would have subsequently more detailed consultation on these particular issues. The third recommendation was around construction exclusivity agreements, and this is something we spent some time on last week during the meeting. So I think it's important to say that the exclusivity agreement, firstly, is not that 100% of all construction contracts go to Lend-Lease. I think it's really important to clarify that. It's about a percentage of work that they would develop themselves. But as was made clear last week, firstly, that exclusivity agreement will be in the papers for the July Cabinet, so people will be able to see that. And secondly, in terms of independent assessments, firstly, that the details of that agreement, as Scott, one of the external lawyers, mentioned, are being drawn up with external lawyers. So there is external advice involved in the agreement itself. But then, as we discussed last week, Councillor Wright, the checking of that exclusivity agreement and reassurance that the company is getting good value for money is absolutely in the top of our minds, and there would be an independent organisation appointed to check value for money and make sure that was being done properly, and that's on the award of the construction contract. The fourth recommendation then was on no loss of target rent properties on Category 1 sites and 50% affordable housing. So as I mentioned earlier, in terms of re-provision of homes in Category 1, the Leader and I have made clear repeatedly that there is a commitment to that. And then secondly, in terms of the 50% affordable, I think this is probably the only recommendation where there is a slight issue, and it's simply that, of course, the Council's policy is for 40%. That percentage is based on significant work by external advisors on what is viable in the borough, so that the Cabinet can't make a firm agreement to guarantee 50%. I'm not sure that would be appropriate. However, what the housing strategy makes very clear, and what we've always made clear in the context development vehicle, is that the Council's policy commits us to maximise the amount of affordable housing. So even though the planning policy says 40, it's minimum of 40. So of course, through this process, we will work as hard as we can to increase those numbers of affordable homes, because we've been clear it's a huge political priority for us. The fifth recommendation then was around the relevant trade unions and agreements. So I think it's really important to restate, Leader, what I made clear at the meeting last week, which is that as a council we believe that the practice of blacklisting is completely unacceptable. We would not allow somebody working for this borough with public money to practice that, and were any evidence brought of any contractor working for the council of blacklisting, we would take that incredibly seriously indeed. However, we have been reassured, having had significant discussions with Lend-Lease about this, and that they have made clear that allegations of blacklisting pertained to a company that they previously bought, that subsequent to that purchase they had made a public apology for that company's involvement. They had settled all claims, and I made clear at the meeting that if the union representatives had any evidence of any ongoing problems, they should bring that to our attention. No evidence has been presented, but of course there's an open offer there to the unions with this report, and of course any partner of the council to raise issues. And it is important to say that we met with the unions before the initial cabinet reports. There'll be further meetings in the normal way with the Haringey unions, and of course blacklisting is one important issue, but with Lend-Lease we will want to discuss a whole raft of issues around good employment practice, around apprenticeships, around training opportunities. We'll want to enshrine those in our agreement. So top-notch employment practice is absolutely a priority, and something we'll be working very hard on. The final recommendation linked to that and asked that we put arrangements in place with Lend-Lease and the construction subsidiaries on local employment and training, just to confirm that commitments to local employment and training will be absolutely central to our agreement with Lend-Lease. And of course members will be able to see that, and that will apply both to Lend-Lease and to subcontractors, which is incredibly important. It's also important to say that this is something we've discussed with Lend-Lease, and in fact Lend-Lease have run a scheme for the last 9 years where they do involve residents in construction from socially excluded groups, and in fact they've got a good track record of involving ex-offenders and others into meaningful employment. So they do have a good track record of inclusive employment, and that's certainly something we will write in to the agreement.
Thanks, Councillor Strickland. Councillor McNamara, I had notification that you had a question.
Thank you, Chair. Would I just make a couple of comments for a question, or Chair?
We give rights to non-cabinet members to ask questions, Councillor McNamara, so I'd be really grateful if you could make your comments in the form of a question. That would be massively helpful. We apply the same rules to and ask the same of everybody who comes here.
Okay. Well, I'd like to ask what consideration has been given, if some explanation can be added to this, in terms of the additional recommendations that were made as a result of the Overview and Scrutiny call-in. Having attended the meeting, which was obviously quite long, it was nigh on 5 hours, there were a number of additional recommendations. So I don't know whether they have been addressed. Well, they may well have just been considered clarifications on new ones, but nevertheless, weight was given to those. I know that Councillor Wright had mentioned those, so perhaps if some element of a response to what since ONS met has been done to consider them.
I'm quite clear that the recommendations from Overview and Scrutiny are in totality in paragraph 3 of the report, so there are 6 recommendations. The Cabinet doesn't have any other recommendations. I'm aware that there was a really long-ranging discussion, but there was nothing further put forward to Cabinet as a recommendation. Councillor Tucker, you have a question?
Thank you, Councillor Cober. Councillor Strickland, in his response on parts 2 and 4 of the scrutiny recommendations, referred to previously existing commitments. When I attended the Scrutiny Committee and was asking about these questions, the response from the officers and advisers was that the HDV could only be held to existing council policy on the issue of right of return and provision of social equivalent housing. Now, existing council policy specifically says that, including in HDV properties, there is no automatic right of return on current rents and terms and conditions, and there is no reference whatsoever in existing council policy to re-provision of the current amount of homes at target rents, and I would add, on the equivalent of current council tenancies. In order, therefore, to hold the HDV to these commitments which have been given, is there now going to be a change in explicit council policy to ensure that these commitments are actually made into practice? Thank you.
Thank you, Leader. Thank you for your question, Councillor Tucker. So, as I made clear at the meeting, the policy that's often quoted is a generic policy for the whole borough. It makes very clear that our aim is to re-provide all affordable homes, but because this policy applies to any estate renewal that happens anywhere in the borough at any point, of course, we do not have a crystal ball, and we cannot guarantee that on sites that might happen in 10, 15 years' time, exactly what the situation will be. However, we have given a very clear commitment on the Category 1 sites. This is also important to say that the fact that the policy says that we can't guarantee on every site re-provision does not mean the Council does not want to do it. In fact, the policy makes very clear our intention is the opposite. On the specific question of the agreement, if I remember rightly, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, what the Assistant Director made very clear was there are different ways of enshrining this type of agreement. We could change the Council policy, we can write it into the agreement with Lend-Lease. There are various ways of taking this forward, and what Dan said at the meeting was that officers were going to, in the negotiation, look at what the best way was to enshrine this. That decision hadn't been made yet, but the commitment to enshrining it, to having a formal agreement on re-provision, was beyond question.
Thanks very much. Sorry, Councillor Tucker, could you ask all your questions? I didn't realise you had further questions. If you just bundle... Sorry,
thank you, Councillor Coby. Just to follow up on that.
Sorry, Councillor Tucker, if I just finish.
Yes.
If you could bundle together all of your questions, ask them in one go, then that would be really appreciated.
Thank you. Councillor Strickland, in that case, there surely would be no problem in enshrining these guarantees into clear council policy that would give everybody the confidence that unless these can actually be delivered by the HDV, there will be no deal.
Thank you, Councillor Tucker. Leader, I think we are at risk of repeating a conversation that was had at the Scrutiny Committee. What was made very clear was these things would be enshrined in writing in agreements, but during the following period, the 5-month period, officers with legal advice would work out how it was best to do that. I was also clear at Scrutiny that we can't make an absolute guarantee in a broad policy that applies to everything ever, because that doesn't make sense, and it would be dishonest to residents to say that schemes that might come up in 15, 20 years' time, we can guarantee now as a Cabinet you will absolutely have re-provision, because the policy doesn't just apply to the development vehicle, it applies to any estate renewal anywhere in the borough done by any developer or any housing association. So I was clear at the Scrutiny Committee I can't make, and I wouldn't recommend the Cabinet making a blanket commitment. We've made a very clear commitment on the HTV. Officers made a very clear commitment at Scrutiny that will be written into agreements. The question is which is the best agreement. That will be taken on the basis of legal advice, but that does not signify a watering down of any commitment, far from it.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Strickland. Given that the key decision number 184 was previously agreed following consideration of the exempt information at the February meeting, and that response to the scrutiny recommendations, as we've just set out this evening, do not require further reference to the exempt part of the reports, Can I ask that Cabinet members confirm that they don't require discussion of the exempt material or the exempt minutes, which are unchanged? And this would include exempt decision number 197. Is that agreed? Okay, so that means that we can now move in accordance with the call-in procedure, having heard the responses to the scrutiny recommendations. Can I refer the Cabinet to the key decision, which is contained in the Cabinet minutes, and the resolutions listed at page 27 and also at page 167 in the exempt papers? After reconsidering the matter, is Cabinet happy to agree to confirm its original decisions subject to the further commitments made by Councillor Strickland in response to the scrutiny recommendations? Agreed? Thank you. As there are no further items of business permitted at the special meeting, the meeting is now closed. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.